So thank you for taking the time to come see this talk. And I got a question for you. As a developer, how many times have you dealt with the accounting team at one point in time? After coding everything in your application, everything is nice and clear, and then, oops, what does this mean from an accounting perspective, right? Now, all of a sudden, all that work is there, and you're having to have a lot more conversations to make sure that your application now somehow funnels into the accounting books. So let's get started. So what is the problem that we're trying to solve here, okay? So as developers, we're kind of used to developing application in what I call a single entry development, right? So basically, typically you have an application database, and you have your transactions nicely done. You have your transaction ID, the timestamp, the amount. This is very common in applications like e-commerce, like anything like subscription software as a service applications and things like that. So, but the real problem is, how do you translate that into something that is makes sense for accounting folks and finance, right? Like the accounting department and all these things, right? So these guys are used to they think in assets, liabilities, and equity, right? And this is like two separate domains, two different kinds of ways of thinking. Usually, this translation, what it means is just times and resources, right? Because if we knew exactly how these transactions funnel into the books from the moment they're originated, then we don't have to deal with this translation problem between the application database and a financial statement. Right, so this is the main problem that Django Ledger is trying to solve. Being proactive in defining standard behavior so we can translate the application logic into financial logic from the moment it actually happens. So that's a mouthful. So now let's put it into perspective. What is Django Ledger? Django Ledger is a scalable, extensible, double-entry bookkeeping and financial analysis framework that is built on top of the Django framework. Now, what that means is that it leverages everything that we know about Django, the scalability, the security, the extensibility, and we take advantage of the Django models. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to dealing with a database or dealing with security or dealing with user authentication. We don't want to go there. We just want to build on top of best practices, and Django definitely help us get started faster. Now, where it sets the reason Django Ledger is so special is because it provides a high-level API, but the important thing here is that Django Ledger will provide a rapid collaboration between developers and accountants. So basically what that means is that Django Ledger is providing the playground, it's providing the environment, so these two very distant domains can interact in a way that we can set and we can code application behavior from the moment that it's born. Not only that, it can be changed and adapted as the application evolves. So it is about being intentional when it comes to finances the moment you define your application logic. Now, with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about me. Here you're going to have a QR code where you're going to find the presentation materials, and you're going to find the code that I'll be reviewing today. You can contact me, you can reach out to me and everything. All the information is going to be there. But just a little bit about me. I am from Venezuela. And I live in Fort Mill, South Carolina, so it's just 2 hours away from here. Not a bad commute, by the way, for those who have traveled 20 hours. And I've been living in the United States for 18 years. So basically, I have about 15 years of experience coding Python. I'm a big Rust fan. Any Rust developers out there? And also, when it comes to the browser, I'll lean towards some TypeScript. I have about 18 years of experience in the energy and financial sectors. And this is a little bit of a story about me. I have a civil engineering background. I don't come from the programming background per se. After that, I went ahead and did more engineering. After that, I went to business. I went to business school. And somehow I started having an interest in data science. And that's what I do today as a full-time. But, at the end of the day, this is a story that I always tell everybody. I did all of this, so I end up in the place that I am today, which is doing what I love, which is programming. I made my hobby my career. And Django Ledger is definitely one of those things that are very close to my heart because I started this project about 5 years ago. And I started from the interest of doing my personal finances simpler. But at the same time, I knew where developers were coming from in the sense of, these problems. I may not be the only one facing these problems, right? So I wanted to do my own books. I wanted to do my own things for my small business. But this cannot be a thing that this can be programmed in a way that can save a lot of time for developers, and that's how it got started. A pet project, and it grew into what it is today, Django Ledger. So let me tell you a little bit about Django Ledger and the complexity that we are talking about here. So it is not just about transactions. And throughout this presentation, you will kind of get exposed to some concepts, obviously, that are related to finances, and it may not be very related with the concept of programming, but this is the problem that we're trying to solve. Whenever we see something like this, credits and debits, you're talking accounting, you're talking bookkeeping, right? But here's the example of an online purchase, right? Like we saw in the prior slide, we can have transactions like there's a sale of $120, which is the one above right there. But just that single transaction can trigger a ripple effect in the books that are not captured at the moment when that sale actually happens, in our application database. For instance, you can have merchant fees, you can have shipping costs, you can have accounts receivable, you can have cost of goods sold, inventory. These are debits, credits, all the things that happen in the finance side of things that ultimately will need to be sorted out for the company to even actually report on this. And at the end of the day, the business owners, they want to know where they stand financially. They may be able to fund the application, but they want to be able to know where they stand financially. So you could see here that debits, credits, there have balances. Sometimes a debit and a credit, which is a really touchy subject for people who probably are confused about what a debit and a credit mean. But basically, you can have situations where if you do a credit to an inventory account, for instance, the balance actually goes down. It doesn't necessarily mean it adds up. So, and this is the problem that we're trying to solve. So, let's talk a little bit about what double entry accounting systems are today and what they mean in terms of, from a database standpoint, right? So let's start with the entity model. The entity model is that company, is that legal entity, is that person, is that thing that you want to keep the books and that you want to do finances on, right? So that is the who. Who are these books, related to? Now, then you have something called the journal entry model, right? The journal entry is really the brains of the operation. So the journal entry is what captures things like timestamps. When are things happening, right? It validates and applies accounting rules. Debits to credits, credits to debits, a debit to a debit account, a credit to a credit account. It keeps track of the balance and basically answers the question, when? When is this happening? Now, the next step is the transaction model. And you could see how one entity model can have multiple journal entry models and one journal entry can have a multiple transactions model. But basically, now the transaction model is how much. How much means that basically you allocate money to a specific account. And you do a debit or a credit to a specific account. And then the chart of accounts model. The chart of accounts model is the bucket of money. Is your expense account, is your bank account, and so forth. Now, what the Django Ledger core model does, it introduces a new model, which is called the ledger model. And when I started developing these applications like 5 years ago, ledger didn't mean a lot of things that, today ledger can mean many different things. But basically, the ledger model in the context of Django Ledger, it means that it is a self-contained and extensible unit of accounting. And it's basically answering the what. What is this doing from an accounting perspective? To put it, to give you an example, that could be a piece of property. That could be a car. That could be a cattle. It could be anything that your mind can relate to, so you can describe your business operation in a way that you can start object-oriented programming around it. And what it does is basically self-contains the accounting to that particular object. Now, when it comes to the chart of accounts, the chart of accounts is basically the list of accounts that are driving your business, right? It definitely categorizes your business into your cash accounts, your bank accounts, here's your inventory, then you have things like credit cards and things like that. But the way Django Ledger actually deals with this problem, and it is a problem because as you absorb legacy accounting and as you absorb new books and things like that, the description of the account may not be very specific, right? So it says checking account, or it says checking, or it says account, or something like that. But from the standpoint of the program, we need to know exactly what is their role. So the Django Ledger, what it does is it normalizes all the accounts into specific roles, so we can attach this role to the specific account, so Django Ledger knows exactly what it is. It is inventory. It is cash. It is the credit card. It is income, and so forth. Now, when it comes to journal entries, this is the brain of the operation. Basically, the journal entry model, what it's going to do, it is going to validate that the golden rule of accounting. Credits must equal debits. And without that, really, there's no accounting system. The moment you have that freedom of entering any amount for any purpose, that's where things start to go a little off, and they should not happen anyway. So Django Ledger incorporates checks every time a journal entry is done or performed or saved to the database to make sure that all the accounting rules are validated before actually hitting the books. So let's talk a little bit about ledger models, okay? So like I said, the ledger model is how we implement object-oriented programming in the context of Django Ledger. So a ledger model, again, it could be anything your heart desires. It could be, if you're dealing with a real estate management company, it could be all the properties, each one of the properties that they own. If you're dealing with a rental car service, it could be the car. Or if you're dealing with a farmer, it could be the tractor, it could be the field, it could be anything that relates to that particular business. So every entity is independent of the entire thing. So, every ledger model is independent from the entity. So a ledger model can produce financial statements on its own. So if you wanted to segregate the finances of a piece of property and you use the ledger to define that object is completely separate from the finances, but you can also generate the financial statement from the entire entity. So examples of that is something like a rental property, a car, could be a super secret project, what if study, anything. Could be an invoice, a bill. So one of the key things about finances and financing systems, financial systems, is the fact of transaction controls, okay? So what that means is basically what we want to make sure is that we incorporate common sense controls, leveraging some of the Django built-in like user model permissions and authentication system to make sure that depending on the user, that user could have certain permissions to do certain things. And that is basic When you see ERP systems, when you see financial systems, you want to make sure that not everybody can do all the things at the same time or certain things, right? So one of the things that the way Django Ledger solves that problem is that you have two separate controls, right? You have controls at the journal entry model, which is a list of transactions, is a model that keeps track of a list of transactions, and the ledger model, which is the object that is being modeled as part of the object-oriented programming strategy, right? So a ledger can be posted or not. A journal entry can be posted or not. So the question is, does that affect the books? So if you had a super secret project that you're working on and it's completely hidden from the public view of the application, you want to make sure that that is not posted yet, or that never posts, by the way. So you make use of these mechanisms to say, hey, this ledger will never post and it will never hit the books. The other option is, let's post the journal entry so we can see it in the financial statements, but don't post the ledger. The ledger keeps, it's still away from the books. So that does not affect the books. The other option is you post a ledger, an empty ledger, without any journal entry being posted. That does not affect the books either. But at the end, what you want to do is that anything that hits the books, you want them to be posted. And there's controls that will built into Django Ledger that will let you control this flow of basically posting information into the ledger. Now, the other thing that is important for users and for developers is the fact that you can have multi-tenancy. Now, let's just say that you are developing an application that is keeping track of multiple entities, in this case, multiple companies, multiple things. You want to make sure that not all Django users have access to all the entities. And this is particularly useful if you are, for instance, granting access to a particular user that owns a particular entity. You don't want that user to kind of have access to the transactions of companies that are not related to that user, right? So this is enforced as the database layer. Every time we create an entity model, it is enforced at the database layer. So throughout the code, and I will show you some code snippets in a little bit, you will see that you have to be very explicit about the user model you are using for a particular operation, just to make sure you filter out any entity that user does not have access to. So Django users, the Django user model is one of the cornerstones of Django Ledger because it helps you assign admins, it helps you assign managers, and isolate certain entities from the actual user database, right? Now, let's do an anatomy of a request, right? What happens when you send a request to Django Ledger? And Django Ledger has several built-in views for many different things, but this is the overall process of what is happening. So the user sends a request. Next thing it does, it lands in a Django view. The Django view will have two key keyword arcs that are absolutely necessary to perform any operation. Number one, the entity slug, which is basically an identifier for a company. It is created automatically when you create a new company. Or the ledger primary key. Again, it's the company or the ledger. A company is really a group of ledgers, a logical grouping of ledgers which rolled up into the company. You know which company you want to look at, or you know which ledger you want to look at. That's step number one. Step number two is having your user model fully authenticated. That gives you access to certain entities and certain things you can do. And from date and to date are two things that are important, because if you're trying to pull a financial statement, and I'll show you examples of that in a minute, you need to bound it. If you're pulling a balance sheet, you need exactly through what date, December 31st, 2023, that balance sheet is going to be related to. Or if you're looking at an income statement, you want to say from December 1 through 31st. Now, you have several other things like database query, and this is the digest phase. Basically, Django Ledger is fully optimized to take advantage of the database. It does a database query, it does a post-Python processing, and then introduces the concept of the financial middleware and returns an I/O context. Middleware examples are, can you check the time for me? 5 minutes? Okay. Middleware examples are things like groupings, like journal entries, like financial radio calculations. Those are middleware examples. So let's start with a practical guide. Basically, this code right here, what does is it introduces, it tells you how to create an entity. Basically, it's that simple. You import the entity model, and you just call the create entity model, and you pass in the user model, the entity name, if you want to use the accrual counting method, and so forth. You can create chart of accounts. Obviously, a chart of accounts is the house where you put all your accounts in. If you are trying to populate an entity and you don't want to start from scratch, you can use the pretty handful populate random data method. It will pretty much fill it in with all the information needed so you can start coding right away. You can create accounts, and this is another example of how you can create accounts and how Django Ledger lets you make better decisions. It kind of validates the code before it actually you put it in the database. There are certain accounting best practices that are followed, so you want to make sure that when you create the account, the account makes sense for accountants as well. Now, the way Django Ledger works is by creating blueprint libraries. So basically, if you're familiar with Django Ledger, Django template tags, it is a similar API. You create a library. That library is registered, and then what you do is you create blueprints. And these blueprints is the playground where accountants and developers can actually collaborate on, because it defines and parameterizes the behavior of your application. Now, in 3 steps, real quick, because I'm short on time. Step number 1, you get a cursor. A cursor is based on the entity model and the user model. Step number 2, you dispatch. Basically, you dispatch the transactions, the blueprint that you just created using the ledger model and the entity that you're operating on. And step number 3, you commit transactions. So all of this is lazy. The dispatch call at the end of the day will just compile all the instructions and do a single entry on the database. Now, when that happens, basically a journal entry is created and the journal entry number is generated. And this is an example of how the financial middleware is helping you kind of drive the financial operation. This is information that the accounting department would definitely require you to have. A journal entry number, a date, the activity, and so forth. Now, the way you produce financial statements is, again, calling the appropriate function, and that will return, you can see for the balance sheet, for the P&L, for the cash flow statement, and that will return something like this. You don't have to read it, but basically, this is the information you need to know in order to continue your application development. This is all the accounts, balance, anything that you need to know about the finances of the application. Another key feature is financial statements in PDF format. It's really nice to share this with accountants and bookkeeping people, so that if they're not familiar with the application, you can definitely print those and share those right away. And one of the things that you can do with Django Ledger, it comes out of the box with an admin UI, which you can start kind of like looking at all the financial information. You can create bills, you can create invoices. This is more of a management UI kind of like tool, which incorporates some billing, invoicement, purchase orders, and so forth. And to finalize, this is an example application. Let's just say that we have an application where you're just going to do some payroll. So on the left, what you have is step number one, what you're going to do is you're going to define a payroll library. And then you define a blueprint to process some employee payroll. In this particular case, you're taking the gross pay and the tax bracket of that employee. And on the right, you have an employee model, which is inheriting from the ledger model, and you're pretty much extending the ledger model to incorporate the details needed for that employee. First name, last name, date of birth, what's your salary, what's your tax bracket. And then you can incorporate the functions necessary to just say, process a payroll. And what processing the payroll does is basically takes the pay date, the user model in this case, and just runs the blueprint for you. All the instructions are predefined in the blueprint. They're parameterized and maintained by the accounting team, but at the same time, the developers have the flexibility to dispatch these functions without minimal intervention on the bookkeeping accounting side. Thank you so much. Once again, that is the QR code. You'll find the presentation, the notebook with all the materials and the code, and I'll be available for questions after the presentation. Thank you.